How did you get here with the boat show? Thank you so much. We're so happy you're here. I'm a little breathless, and I'm Grace Cavalieri, here to welcome you. I served as the Poet Laureate of Maryland from 2018 till 2024, last week actually, and I am so happy with this program. This is our second poetry reading of the inaugural poetry series at St. John's of Annapolis. And thanks to the President's office. Bruce Douglas, would you stand up? It's all about Bruce. It's all about Bruce. And I would like to thank him very much, who made this possible. And also thank the co-sponsors, Annapolis Magazine, Annapolis Home Magazine, which is totally gorgeous. Does anybody have one here to hold up? Yes. It is an absolute beautiful thing, and our poets are featured every other month. Yes. And that is, the publishers are Kimberly Taylor, who is in the green, and Robert Haywood, who is standing up and who drove us here. So they're our publishers, our co-sponsors, and we're so happy to have Carolyn Forche. After the reading, there will be a book signing in the bookstore adjacent to this hall, and you can all follow us out there to find out where it is with Carolyn. And now Kimberly Taylor is going to introduce Carolyn Forche.
So glad to have Carolyn here. She just returned from Slovenia, so it's great that she made it. Carolyn Forche is renowned for her piercing lyric gifts, for recording through poetry the war in El Salvador, as well as conflicts in other countries. In her recent work, she mines the glacial till of the human condition, presenting its reoccurring atrocities and beauties through poems that, though they address our times, seem to transcend them. She's published 16 books. Her newest book, In the Lateness of the World, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award. She's won many top, if not all, awards in American poetry, including the Yale Series for Younger Poets, Poetry Society of America's Alice Faye DiCastagnola Award, a Los Angeles Times Book Award, and won fellowships from the Lannan Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Academy of American Poets. She taught most recently at Georgetown University as a professor of poetry and English, where she directed the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you very much for waiting for me. We were a few minutes late. And thank you, Grace, for including me in this wonderful new series. Very impressive. And thank you, Kimberly, for everything. And especially also St. John's, which is a school I wanted to go to when I was young. And I love the curriculum here. I really admire it. And I'm really happy that they have added a poetry series. Grace has reminded me that it's been a long time since the war in El Salvador, and that there are generations who don't know about it. It's possible that some of them were born after it was all over again, most of my students now. So she has asked me to begin the reading with a couple of poems from this book, which is my second book, The Country Between Us. And 7 of the poems arise out of my experience. I was in El Salvador between 1978 and 1980. It was not the war yet, but it was a period of very of conflict. It was called the time of the death squads, because there was a lot of extrajudicial killing at that time. And I was guided there by the poet Claribel Alegria's nephew, and his name was Leonel Gomez Vidas, and he wanted a poet to learn all about El Salvador before the war came. And I said, well, don't you want a journalist rather than a poet? And he said, no, when the war comes, we'll have lots of journalists. I need a poet right now. That's what we need. And I said, what? Why? And he said, because you have weird minds, you pay attention to everything, and he said, you see things differently, and you touch the heart, so which newspapers do not. So he wanted me to come, and I finally went, and I wound up working closely with people associated with Archbishop Romero's office, who was the Archbishop of El Salvador, who was assassinated in March 1980. So I will just read a short poem, and then I will read my very controversial poem, and I hope you'll forgive one little word in that poem. This is called The Visitor. I went into a prison ostensibly to visit a prisoner, but also to make a mental map of the inside of the prison. The Visitor. In Spanish, he whispers, there is no time left. It is the sound of scythes arcing in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador. The wind along the prison, cautious as Francisco's hands on the inside, touching the walls as he walks. It is his wife's breath slipping into his cell each night while he imagines his hand to be hers. It is a small country. There is nothing one man will not do to another. And this next one is The Colonel. It's a prose poem. It's shaped like a little block of prose. It has a bad word in it. It has an obscenity in it. The Federal Communications Commission thinks there's only one obscenity in it, so it gets beeped out on the radio. But I think there are two obscenities, and maybe you want to listen for the other one. So it has difficult subject matter. The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house. To scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, say nothing. The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. I am tired of fooling around, he said. As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves. He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. Something for your poetry, no? He said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. San Salvador, May 1978. Okay, so, sorry. I will move along many, many decades. I would like to read poems from the new book. in the lateness of the world with the bird on the cover. Uh, I'm going to begin with a poem that we're going to be talking about later, which is The Museum of Stones. It's an invocation poem, the first poem of the book. It was written for an Irish musician who was a friend of mine, and he went all over the world busking, you know, where you put the hat on the street and you play music. He didn't want to buy souvenirs, but he wanted souvenirs. So he decided to choose one ordinary stone or pebble from the ground in each place he was and mount it and label it and put it on a wall. So pebble from beneath the Eiffel Tower, July 1977, that kind of thing, ordinary pebble. So there was a beautiful wall of these stones in his flat, and I said, well, would you mind if I made one of these too? You know, sort of copied his museum. And he said, no, everybody should have a museum. You should do this. So I started doing the same thing, only I didn't label them or put them in a nice wall museum. I put them, well, they were on the desk, and eventually they are all in a grocery bag, and I don't know which is which, so I can't ever make the museum. And this turned into a kind of elegy for him. And I'll talk more about it later. Museum of Stones. These are your stones, assembled in matchbox and tin, collected from roadside, culvert, and viaduct, battlefield, threshing floor, basilica, abattoir. Stones loosened by tanks in the streets, from a city whose earliest map was drawn in ink on linen, schoolyard stones in the hand of a corpse, pebble from Baudelaire's Oui, stone of the mind within us, carried from one silence to another, stone of cromlech and cairn, schist and shale, hornblende, agate, marble, millstones, ruins of choirs and shipyards, chalk, marl, mudstone from temples and tombs, stone from the silvery grass near the scaffold, stone from the tunnel lined with bones, lava of a city's entombment, stones chipped from lighthouse, cell wall, scriptorium, paving stones from the hands of those who rose against the army, stones where the bells had fallen, where the bridges were blown, those that had flown through windows, weighted petitions, feldspar, rose quartz, blue schist, Nice, and Chert. Fragments of an abbey at dusk, sandstone toe of a Buddha, mortared at Bamiyan. Stone from the hill of 3 crosses and a crypt. From a chimney where storks cried like human children. Stones newly fallen from stars. A stillness of stones, a heart. Altar and boundary stone, marker and vessel, first cast, load and hail, bridge stones and others to pave and shut up with, stone apple, stone basil, beechberry, stone break, concretion of the body, as blind, as cold, as deaf, all earth a quarry, all life a labor, stone-faced, stone drunk with hope, that this assemblage of rubble, taken together, would become a shrine or holy place, an ossuary immovable and sacred, like the stone that marked the path of the sun as it entered the human dawn. Okay, so we go to, thank you. I also want to greet people listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube. We are live streamed, something of the 21st century. So this is called The Boatman. I taught in northern Greece on an island called Thassos for 7 summers or so, and it's very close to Lesbos, which is the island where there is a vast refugee camp. And at the time I was teaching, especially in the first summers, there were many, many boats filled with refugees from various countries trying to reach Europe. And they would tip into the sea, they would sink, some of them were, and the Greek fishermen with the little boats would try to save people. And I took all of this in and I thought, I want to know something about this. I want to do something about this. And then I took a job at Marquette University for one semester. Of course, it was the winter semester. It was Milwaukee. It was very cold. Don't do the winter semester. But I lived downtown in a hotel, and usually I walked. But if the weather was terrible, which it always was, I took a taxi. And there were about 100 taxis wandering around downtown Milwaukee. But the same person picked me up more than once, more than twice. And on the third time, he said, "I've driven you before." And I said, "I know, I recognize you." And I looked on the visor where they have the picture, and I said something I never say. I never ask this. I blurted out, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Homs in Syria." And we pulled up in front of the hotel, and I said, "How did you get here?" And turned off the taxi. It was snowing. The snow covered up the car, and he told me the story on the condition that I would write about it. So I said, "Well, I don't know if I can write about it. Poems don't often get written that way on assignment. You know, I'm not in control of this matter." And he said, "Well, you see if it happens. I would like you to write it." So this is what came of that. And it's called The Boatman. And it's his story. "We were 31 souls," he said, "in the gray sick of sea, in a cold rubber boat, rising and falling in our filth. By morning, this didn't matter. No land was in sight. All were soaked to the bone, living and dead. We could still float," we said, "from war to war. What lay behind us but ruins of stone, piled on ruins of stone? City called Mother of the Poor, surrounded by fields of cotton and millet. City of jewelers and cloak makers, with the oldest church in Christendom and the sword of Allah. If anyone remains there now, they would be utterly alone. There is a hotel named for it in Rome, 200 meters from the Piazza di Spagna, where you can have breakfast under the portraits of film stars. There the staff cannot do enough for you. But I am talking nonsense again, as I have since that night. We fetched a child, not ours, from the sea, drifting face down in a life vest, its eyes taken by fish or the birds above us. After that, Aleppo went up in smoke, and Raqqa came under a rain of leaflets warning everyone to go. Leave, yes, but go where? We lived through the Americans and Russians, through Americans again, many nights of death from the clouds, mornings surprised to be waking from the sleep of death, still unburied and alive, with no safe place. Leave, yes, we'll obey the leaflets, but go where? To the sea to be eaten? To the shores of Europe to be caged? To Camp Misery and Camp Remain Here? I ask you then, where? You tell me you are a poet. If so, our destination is the same. I find myself now the boatman driving a taxi at the end of the world. I will see that you arrive safely, my friend. I will get you there. Okay, so let's see. You're very kind. Thank you. I don't know. I wanted to read new poems too, so I'm going to be very Ilya Kaminsky is a poet many of you may know. He came as a teenager to the United States from Ukraine, from Odessa, beautiful port city on the Black Sea. And he had a lot of dreams and memories and fantasies about the childhood in Odessa. So some years into his 20s, I decided to take him back there. It's always a mixed thing to go back to a place that you had to leave and to see it again. We all know how it is to go back to the towns we grew up in and how everything is a little smaller than we remember. You know, well, for Ilya it was many things, but I wrote this poem, Exile, for him, about taking him back. The city of your childhood rises between steppe and sea, wheat and light, white with the dust of cockle shells, stargazers, and bones of pipefish. City of limestone soft enough to cut with a hatchet, where the sea unfurls and acacias brought by Greeks on their ships turn white in summer. So yes, you remember? This is the city you lost. City of smugglers and violinists, chess players and monkeys, an opera house, a madhouse, a ghost church with wind for its choir, where two things were esteemed, literature and ships, poetry and the sea. If you return now, it will not be as a being visible to others. And when you walk past, it will not be as if a man had passed, but rather as if someone had remembered something long forgotten and wondered why. If you return, your father will be alive to prepare for you his mint cucumber soup, or give you the little sweet called bird's milk. And after hours of looking with him for his sandals lost near the sea, you visit again together the amusement park where your ancestors are buried, and then go home to the apartment house built by German prisoners of war, to whom your father gave bread, which you remember surprised you. You take the tram to a stop where it is no longer possible to get off, and he walks with you until he vanishes, still holding in his own your invisible hand. Let's see what, I try always, I'm not very funny in my poems, so I try to be funny in between my poems because I don't want you to go home all depressed, you know, because that could happen. So I go through the book thinking, no, that's too depressing. No, this one's too depressing. So anyway, it's not really that it is, but Morning on the Island is about, you know, the pine beetle that has kind of started to eat the forests of the Western Canada and the United States. If you travel there now, anyway, this is something that comes out of learning about that and experiencing it in the Pacific Northwest. It's called Morning on the Island. The lights across the water are the waking city. The water shimmers with imaginary fish. Not far from here lie the bones of conifers, washed from the sea and piled by wind. Some mornings I walk upon them, bone to bone, as far as the lighthouse. A strange beetle has eaten most of the trees. It may have come here on the ships playing music in the harbor, or it was always here, a winged jewel, but in the past was kept still by the cold of a winter that no longer comes. There is an owl living in the firs behind us, but he is white, meant to be mistaken for snow, burdening a bough. They say he is the only owl remaining. I hear him at night, listening for the last of the mice, and asking who of no other owl. Poor owl. They try to, thank you. I've heard this translated and read in translation, and they don't have this who. Owls don't say who anywhere else in the world. I found out that's not what they say. So they just gave up and went who when they read the poem. So I guess owls don't speak the same way in every country. Let's see, the little poem from childhood, Charmalapi. Charmalapi is like a beautiful sadness. It begins with a word as small as the cry of Athena's owl, an ache in the cage of breath, as when we say, can hardly breathe. In sleep, we see our name on a stone, for instance. Or while walking in the rain among graves, we feel watched. Others are still coming into our lives. They come, they go out. Some speak quietly beside us on a bench near where koi swim. At night, there is a light sound of wings brushing the walls. Not now is what it sounds like, or two other words. But they are the same passerines as live in the stone eaves, as forage in the air toward night. To see them, one must not be looking. And I'm gonna bring maybe one, I don't know. Thank you. I want to share with you a poem I wrote for, the poem I want to share is for my grandmother. My grandfather died a month before I was born. And this poem is called How Her Husband Went. You see, Anna, my grandmother, who died when I was 18, has to be in every poetry book. I'm writing at night and I can feel her in the room saying, I want to be in the book. So this is her poem probably for the next book. How Her Husband Went. Not the war, but the orchards. Not flight from aerial bombardment, but lunches under linden trees with fig jam, cheese, and oysters simmered in milk. I still have the quilt made from swatches of clothing sewn for wealthy women out of the dark velvet where sleep the stars of winter. I keep it in a box with the library scarf, with my tailor's chalk and straight pins stuck in a cushion. In the quilt, there is a square of silk from the dress made for a countess. Silk, the color of sky before rain. Lace dipped in tea and a corset of whalebone. It never ceases to amaze what the rich throw away. Shoes still with soles on them. Clothes no moths have eaten. Today we had herring and cream for breakfast. I wanted schnapps. They wouldn't give me that. So all day I pretended to be far away. When my husband's heart stopped, he was chopping wood for winter. He fell into the snow, and the snow was still falling into his eyes when I found him. And I'm going to end with a poem. Thank you. Last poem is What Comes. It's my strangest poem, and I wrote it when I was in, this is for all of you who have gone through, things like chemotherapy. So I wrote it in chemo, and I was pretty terrified when I wrote it, and I'm not usually, I don't write when I'm terrified, I write when I'm miserable, or when I'm nothing, when I'm even. So it begins with a quote by René Char. I brought from despair a basket so light, my love, that it could have been woven of willows. And this is the poem, and then we'll be done. To speak is not yet to have spoken, the not yet of a white realm of nothing left, neither for itself nor another, a no longer already there, along with the arrival of what has been, light and the reverse of light, terror as walking blind along the breaking sea, body in whom I lived, the not yet of death darkening what it briefly illuminates, an unknown place as between languages, back and forth, breath to breath, as a calm in the surround rises, fireflies in lindens, an ache of pine. You have yourself within you. Yourself. You have her. And there is nothing that cannot be seen. Open then to the coming of what comes. Okay, thank you. What happened? Okay, this is the poem we're going to talk about.
Yes, we're going to talk about the Museum of Stones, and
Just for a
I'd
minute.
like you to read the poem and see if you have any questions.
Me too? I have questions.